and welcome to the Pragmatic Product Chat series, where we tackle the biggest challenges facing today's product management, product marketing, and other market and data-driven professionals with some of the best minds in the industry. I'm Rebecca Caligeris for Pragmatic Institute, your host for this episode. Today, I am extremely excited to have on John Rossman. John is a writer, business advisor, a keynote speaker. He was an early Amazon executive who played a key role in launching Amazon Marketplace, which gets pretty much most of my money, particularly this time of year. He has served as the senior technology advisor at the Gates Foundation, innovation advisor at T-Mobile. He's also a best-selling author, and that's what we're going to talk about today is his newest book, which you can all see from my post-it notes here. I have definitely read and digged into. Big Bet Leadership, your transformation playbook for winning in the hyper-digital era. It's really a very actionable guide for leaders who are leading complex transformations. But as I read through it, I mean, it is so applicable to what we do in product particularly when we're trying to think of innovation and innovative products, right? We're all used to Horizon 1. We can add some features, we can tweak, but in this day and age, if we really want to get ahead and stay ahead, we need to be able to think beyond just those incremental steps with our products and our organizations and really think about things differently. And I think this conversation is going to help everybody do that. So welcome, John.
Rebecca, wow, thank you very much for the introduction. And I appreciate the preparation you put into actually reading the book and everything.
It was delightful. I always try to ask, I gave a hint a little bit of it, but kind of like to get everyone's origin stories when they come on, right? How do you get where you are, and why are you really, really passionate about this idea of big bet leadership?
Well, personal origin story was, I'm an industrial engineer by background and by education. So I've always been interested in kind of this interchange and intersection of efficiency, usability, ergonomics, and integration, right? Like, how do you actually get things to flow? I've had a lot of cool and opportunities to grow different aspects of that. But this latest book, Big Bet Leadership, I got to be the senior innovation advisor at T-Mobile. My client was Kevin McCaffrey. His job was to build a incubation engine kind of beyond the core at T-Mobile. I got to work with them for over 3 years. And what we did was we took a lot of the approaches from Amazon and rebuilt them from kind of first principle, specifically for kind of the homework assignment at T-Mobile, which was kind of like new things beyond the core, and for a company that distinctly did not want to be like Amazon. And so, but the first principles there are fairly universal in design. So that's really where the relationship with the co-author, Kevin McCaffrey, came from, and where a lot of the genesis for this book came from was from the work we did at T-Mobile.
And it's really interesting how you put that T-Mobile would not say, I want to be Amazon, but yet the principles that made Amazon successful could be applied to T-Mobile. And I think it's those principles that you lay out in the book that can be used for various versions of good, right?
I was at Amazon from early 2002 through late 2005, so four years. I've essentially made a career since then in helping companies and teams recreate or create strategic advantage. And the mechanisms I always use, I come back to Amazon. Like it's such a thoughtful place about what they prioritize, how they work together, how they think through things, how they're willing to experiment, how they think big but bet small, all of those things. And so regardless of kind of like what you think the impact of Amazon and some of their business practices, you can learn from Amazon, and everything, right? And that's essentially been my career, and that's the thesis that you're talking about there.
Yeah, and that's that intentionality. Like, it's so easy to get caught up in the moment, and you're just like, and then we did it because it came up in an opportunity, and we jumped and we dropped all our processes. The number of companies I've seen do that, like this shiny thing came up, and it was so exciting. We didn't do any of the things that we usually do. And so I think the intentionality is clear in here. And the other thing that's really nice about the book is there's intentional process, but it is still very agile and lean. It is not like intentional process in 6 months you can come back with your idea and we'll do it. It's really designed to allow the decisions faster.
Well, one of my guiding principles is I don't like to have to create a transformation to get to a transformation, you know what I mean, right?
Yes.
And so I try to adapt like whatever momentum and rhythm and cultural norms as much as possible, because my job is to get a job done, you know, and
Yes.
everything, right?
Yep.
And so that I think is reflected in kind of what you're saying, which is it's a playbook. There are things to do, but it is not a methodology in that it doesn't say this is how it has to be done and everything, right? And so more or less, it's kind of oriented around here's a problem that you're going to run into. Here's a principle, and then here's some tactics, but you can find other tactics to get those same things done.
Yeah. Yeah. It's super interesting too, because when we talk about transformations, there was a fairly recent research study from PwC that talked about, was all CEOs of enterprise organizations. And it was like about the importance of transformation, right? And it was something like 80% of CEOs said that if they didn't transform, the company wouldn't be around in 10 years. And these are like giant brands that we all grew up with. And in your book, you have a stat that says that 73% of enterprises fail to derive any business value from digital transformation. Not as much as they thought, not as much as it cost, but like any. And that's scary, because in today's world, it's so volatile and there's so many things. There's the COVID and there's AI, and there's always going to be things like this. So transformation is constant. And if we're all failing at it, that's going to be a problem, right?
Yeah. And the problem gets even worse, right? Because they fail for lots of reasons. They're not like a simple set of root cause reasons, you know, and everything, right? And so we set up the book to kind of tackle the biggest groups of reasons, right? So there's kind of big bet thinking. The way that we aspire and think through things is a big source, and communicate is a big source of the problems. Big bet environment. Well, the way that we situate these initiatives and how we have them operate is a big challenge. And then big bet management, how senior leaders and the teams that serve senior leaders actually do their job in managing these transformations. And so that's kind of how we grouped and organized the book, was to tackle what we saw the three big groupings of the many reasons why these transformations rarely deliver the impact that was envisioned from the beginning. And one of the key reasons they don't is because we actually don't define either the problem we are trying to solve or what our hypothesis is for the future state. And so it makes it very difficult to actually like recognize, like, well, did we deliver or not?
So, and then you talk about that. So I want to hit all three of those things, right? But before we do, let's just, for like level setting, let's define for me what you mean by a big bet.
Yeah. So a big bet gets called many things within a company, right? It's an AI strategy. It's an operating model transformation. It can be a new product launch, a new geography launch. But at their core, a big bet has these two primary attributes. One, it has major opportunity and aspiration for being a significant business driver or significant business change. But the other driver it has many risks to it, many unknown unknowns, many dependencies that are directly outside of our control. And if there's one thing that I hope that people get from this conversation is that these are fundamentally different than a well understood or incremental project, a line of sight incremental thing. We don't have to put all of this in front of us and everything. Like, we recognize the problem. We have a really good understanding and control of what it's going to take to get to the outcome. That's what an incremental situation is, right? It might be a new set of product features or a new set of users or something like that. But a big bet is fundamentally different, right? It has high potential, but it has all of these risks. And so you have to fundamentally tackle it differently. And that's one of the mistakes. Well, there's actually two mistakes that companies make in this area. One is they don't recognize when they're actually making a big bet. And so they approach it with a very incremental mindset. And the second is they think it's a big bet when actually it's not. And both of those can be problems.
Yeah, no, I think of it as it's the disruptors, and disruptors, and that gives you both the positive and the negative, right? Disruptors, like, ooh, disrupting the market, that's amazing. But also disruptors disrupt what works in your organization today, those processes in place. It makes you think differently than particularly the large enterprise companies most of us work at do. And that's where you really have to be thoughtful about how you can make something different succeed in an environment that is set up for what exists today.
Yeah. One of the unrecognized both opportunities and situations that people don't recognize as a big bet is when we're undergoing a major kind of operating model reset, right? How do we get work done? How do we get more out? How do we gain efficiency and speed in the organization? That's kind of what an operating model kind of connect together, strategy versus execution. And those tend to be big bets, but we don't actually recognize like the degree of opportunity and the degree of change and risk that's needed. And they don't think through, well, how do we think things are actually going to be different in the future? What's the real problems we're trying to change today? And they just kind of, put lipstick on the pig.
I mean, you talk a lot about you talk about cost infrastructure changes again as a type of digital. And again, people don't think of that. You think of like the new product, the new offering, the new thing that's shiny out here. But we can transform our businesses in all different areas, all of which needs to be handled appropriately.
The best businesses in the world have both an incredible customer value proposition to them and a cost advantage or an eye towards a cost advantage in the market. So if you think about how Elon Musk, all of his companies win, they win by having both an incredible customer value proposition and a per unit cost advantage relative to their competitors. And if you can do that, you can do things that your competition cannot follow you on.
Yeah, absolutely. I also like that because I'm a New England girl, that you call big bets are about solving wicked problems. And so I just felt my Boston coming very happy with that. But
I get asked, like, what do you do, and everything, right? And it's like I'm a systems thinker, and I like to think about really complex, wicked problems, right? And that's fundamentally what I do. I don't have mastery of really any of these disciplines, but I've integrated them together to help leaders and businesses really solve wicked problems.
Nice. All right. So we talk about in Big Bet, there's really like 3 areas that we talk about: thinking, environment, and management. Let's start with thinking, right? When we talk about thinking, one of the things that really struck me as interesting and made a lot of sense is that I would say that what you are a proponent of is thinking in memos, right? And I don't know, I mean, I think some people who know the Amazon story know about memos, but like you're very firm on there's a series of memos you need to create, and there's a reason why you pick memos. So let's start with why memos?
Yeah,
why, John? That feels so old-fashioned.
It's actually the one appendix we put in the book, which is kind of called Why Memos, right? And it's kind of the research and the story behind why thinking in memos for yourself as a team is a completely different way of working. So Amazon has their version of this. It's called working backwards. So every project, every significant kind of correction of error, every big idea gets worked through a set of memos. And we reverse engineer that specifically for kind of the situation of a big bet. But if you can't write something out in full paragraphs with a cohesive thought line through it, you're not ready to pitch the idea, and everything, right? Like that's the essence of this. It will help you think better and come in with a more defensible, well-rounded approach. And it will help you recognize the subtle options that you actually have and the assumptions that you are making about the situation or what you're proposing to do. And so kind of thinking slow and capturing your thoughts, then it sets you up to be able to get the best of everybody else, right? Like get their thinking on the situation and give them a deeper insight into how you're actually thinking about it, right? And so, Bezos recently did a really good interview with Lex Friedman where he broke down kind of why working in memos is so much different and so much better. And that's a good clip. But that's the kind of, again, the first principles techniques here, which is stay in the problem space a little longer, deeply understand your user or the problem differently, have hypotheses about what you think the solution is, and identify the limited number. We always talk about it in terms of 3 to 5 things that must be true that are high risk in order to enable that outcome that you want. So we call this thinking in outcomes, but it is a reverse engineered approach of Amazon's working backwards techniques.
No, and I really like so fair note that I am a writer. So reading and writing is very comfortable to me. It is probably my preferred way to learn, right? But one of the things I thought was interesting about the memos, it's not just about clarity of your own, right? It is about making sure everything adds up, but also the clarity that if someone else reads your 4-page, 6-page memo, there's less of the leaps. No one's filling in the blanks like you do with bullets, right? It's very sexy and everyone talks about no one has any attention. So let's do a canvas. Let's do a couple slides, which I get. But there is a clarity here and a depth here when you're taking big bets that is worth the time to make sure that you've really well thought out and that there's alignment there.
What people don't recognize is that this is actually the fastest, cheapest, and most effective testing of your concepts that you can do. I get people to push back on me and it's like, God, we're taking a long time on this. This is kind of expensive to do. And it's like, no, you don't understand. This is 1/100th the cost. Like once we actually start building product, deploying and testing with teams and everything, that's when not just costs escalate, but degrees of freedom start being limited, right? It's hard to make changes. And we give an analogy in the book about an archer, right? It's really easy when you're an archer to pull back the arrow and kind of make adjustments, but it's really hard to change the flight of an arrow once it's released, right? Like that's what we are recognizing here is the best time to test these things out and have optionality in front of us and to really think about these things intentionally is before we really commit to something.
Yeah. And so you talk about in the book. So one of the things that Pragmatic talks about all the time, it's all about problems, understanding the problem. So your first memo is like, what sucks memo? Like what sucks? And that like, we're all in. Understand the problems they have, understand who has the problems then it's the outcome definition, right? Which is the killer feature. What does it look like on the other side? That's understanding the today and then tomorrow. Your third one, everyone's logically going to go like, oh, okay, obviously now we need to talk about financials, right? Like but I really like your take on the financial memo because I've done these and I've been pitched these where you're like, well, I need some revenue numbers and we are just making stuff up, right? We're identifying what we're using to make it up, but we all know we're making it up. And I think if you can just dig a little deeper on sort of your outcome financial memo, I think it's a really nice way of looking at this.
Yeah. Well, it's exactly as you said, which is when we're building these potential ideas, you do have to have an idea of to the size of the prize and what we think the future could be. But what quickly gets forgotten is the fact that these are guesses. These are part of what needs to be tested out early. And back to a prior point we made, people don't think about like, well, what's the cost model innovation that we could deploy? So what we do is we encourage you to do the modeling that you need to do, but then write a memo about it, a short memo that actually says what are the critical risks that are part of this financial model that need to become part of our test log that we test upfront and early relative to this. And so we keep in the front of us the fact that these things are not facts. These are guesses and oftentimes wild ass guesses. And that we need to recognize that. And that's one of the things that helps teams and companies be successful at this is understanding when is something a highly potential or close to a fact versus when are things truly high risk and are guesses. And we use very specific language to help everybody understand we are in the land of betting here, right? And that is what allows kind of this culture of quote unquote failure of testing and learning to be successful at scale is because we're precise in our language that, hey, don't hold me to this budget or to this number or to this projection. We all know that it is a guess at its heart. What we're going to do about it, though, is we're going to figure out how do we cleverly test these things up early and recognize it so that we can gain some better visibility and understanding of it. And therefore, we lower the risk relative to these high risk aspects of our transformation that we're contemplating.
And we're going to touch a bit on that in a minute, like the sort of knowing what risks to test first, because I think a lot of us do it wrong. But before we do, one of the other things I appreciated in your book, you talk a lot about people who've made big bets, right? You talk about Bezos, you talk about Musk, you talk about Gates. And we've all done this too, where people are like, well, Elon Musk didn't like invent the Tesla, right? He took over someone else's company, and Bill Gates, right? So we can all be like, oh, it wasn't really their idea. And you hit that very directly, right? You're like, we all know what you're thinking. Oh, it's really someone else's idea, because that's how the world works, right?
Yeah. So this is the second chapter, which is about, we titled called Play Chess, Not Checkers. And it really helps us get over this kind of, the father of the idea, like
yes.
not important. We've all built on the shoulders of other. What matters is you making an impact and making progress and having your version of this. But it also gets at a technique of testing and learning early, which is reverse engineering. And companies, teams do not take the time or have the technique to properly learn the lessons that we can by studying history here, right? And so this is a specific set of techniques that can be used to help us test our ideas much better by looking at analogous situations and trying to really uncover not the macro story, but what was their version of the what sucks memo? What was their version of the outcome definition? How did they test and learn failure, success? And how does that apply to our situation? So that's kind of the technique that we help deliver there.
Right. Embracing the fact that, yes, there are other things like that. Let's learn from that. Let's not ignore it. Let's learn from it and make decisions that way. So I love that. All right. So that's the very high level. There's a lot more in the book about sort of big bet thinking. Let's go. The second part is big bet environment, right? So talk a little bit about what you mean there and what really is sort of the critical factors.
Well, a big bet environment, again, is kind of like the context or the rules of the road that we put this initiative and this team, we'll call it a team, kind of into, right? And the first chapter is called Opening Moves, and it's basically about deal with the stuff that you know is going to be an issue early, right? You predict, the every chapter I have a quote that I think kind of gives
Bill Belichick makes it in there. Another thing.
And the one for this chapter, Opening Moves, is by Sun Tzu, and it's like essentially the best battle is the one that's never fought. And that's the essence of this chapter, which is we know that there are going to be policies, environment issues, stakeholder issues, decision-making frameworks that work for the business in general, but that will actually be a major risk factor relative to the speed that you need to proceed on these if we don't adjust them. So identify them early, engage your stakeholders, be clear about your rationale for what's needed. And if you cannot get the type of adjustment that's needed, don't proceed, because you're guaranteeing this is going to be a challenge to failure. So that's the Opening Moves chapter. The Think Big, Bet Small chapter is fundamentally about taking these critical insights from the memos that we've written and creating a test log, a prioritized test log that helps us design the right, discrete, small experiment to help gain better visibility, better insights relative to this particular risk factor. And the reason why most teams can't do this well is because they haven't done the upfront work to actually discreetly understand the real risks of what we're proposing to go do. And when you don't understand the real discrete risks and have them stack ranked, well, then you can't do small experiments against them. All you can do is kind of like, well, we're just going to proceed, we're going to launch, and then we'll learn about all of these things together and everything. Well, that's a bet big approach. Our approach is to think big but bet small. And the irony of the title of the book, it's Big Bet Leadership. The big is the size of the ambition. The big is not actually the size of the bet that we're recommending. We actually propose Bezos always talks about kind of think big, but it's like, yeah, but you got to bet small on these things. And then the last chapter in this section is called Championship Habits. And I named it that because it's like, you're covering some things that are kind of obvious and common, but yet they get underplayed and they need to be tuned specifically for a transformation. And the two things we talk about are kind of the team culture and communication techniques that are so vital to being successful in these transformational opportunities. And so we've kind of walked through a couple of best practices relative to team culture and communication that are required.
The communication one resonated with me partly because I fall on this. This is one of those lessons that annoys me that I learned multiple times in my career, is the need to communicate like the same thing over and over, right? Like in my head, I communicated and it was clear everyone was on board, and then I don't want to bore them and waste their time. And like that is my job, is to level set with them every time we touch base. Now that's not let's all read the same 6-page memo at the start of everything, but it is making sure that there is a positioning statement, for lack of a better word, for the effort we're doing, that we are consistently going. And I think you say something like, if you think you're saying it too much, you probably have twice as much more you should be saying it. And I was like, oh, yep, that's true.
Right. So, we give credit to a few of the books that really influenced our techniques relative to this. And the book that we give credit to here is from the Heath brothers, Switch, How to Change When Change is Hard, right? And it talks about that you need to appeal to both the emotional and the intellectual side of people. And that you need to do it in a story format. And then you need to repeat. And, to your point, I tell the simple story about how, when we were launching the marketplace business and Bezos would walk down to my office, he wouldn't ask me, John, how are things going in the marketplace launch? He would drill me specifically on like the essence of the superpower that we were going to give merchants, which was the ability to register, launch, and sell without talking to anybody, right? And so that's what he would ask me about. And that's, of all of Jeff's really amazing talents, it's that on point, helpful strategic communication. And one of the really negative things that senior leaders tend to do in these moments is they talk about oblique, obtuse communications, like we have to change, we have to have better results, we have to provide better customer service. All of that's true, but it's actually not just not helpful, it's actually damaging, because we all do what we're going to do, which is we're going to make our own meaning relative to what that communication means, right? And so if you can be much more specific about either the problem we are solving or our hypothesis about like, how are we going to solve that problem for the customer? And what's the thing we really have to keep our eye on? That is the superpower of being a chief repeating officer and being very, very good at it.
Yeah. And I love that term, chief repeating officer. I also think you bring that segues very nicely into the third part of the book, the management, right? Because one of the things just in the question that Bezos asked you there is that he is not asking you, hey, did you guys like follow up on that? What technique did you use for this? He's like, how are we going towards the goal? And that is, as you put in your book, it is where the manager should live. And it's a great place to be. But too often those status reports or the check-ins are like way down in the details. And then everybody just is like, oh, I guess we will just ask them all the questions and wait for them to tell us what to do. Right.
Well, yeah. I mean, there's a few things packed into all that. One of them is about how to keep the main thing, right? And depending upon the conversation, you need to really focus on the critical, high risk, high power thing. The other is about like senior leadership can only help when you actually bring like a specific challenge or problem that you're having. And so, of all the lessons I've learned in like driving big change, and if you asked, and I was a partner at Alvarez and Marcel for 12 years, and if you asked anybody who worked for me, well, what's John's golden rule? They would say John's golden rule is feature the bad news, and by forcing and being thoughtful about like my job isn't to sell something, my job isn't to look good, my job as a product or project leader is to actually syndicate, to share my problems and get people's best help and assistance on it. Well, that's a sharing the bad news technique, and that's what we really need to do when we're working internally here.
Yeah. Also in the management, when you talk about the decision points, right, where you either have continue, kill, pivot, or confusion, and only one of those is a failure, right?
Right. Well, and that's one of my favorite chapters because it's what we all get wrong. It is recognizing these high stakes moments in the life cycle of a situation, and not having good hygiene as to actually how we plan, set up, execute the meeting. And we fall into all sorts of bad habits relative to them. And we tend to play kind of what I would refer to as small ball, right? Like just focus, audit the situation, come up with a really simplistic understanding of why something is the way it is and kind of blame others. We love to blame our vendors or our consultant or whatever it is, and everything. That's the easiest thing in the world to do. And there's a time and a moment for that, but it's not now. Our job in this high stakes meeting is to decide, do we continue? Do we pull back? Do we kill this? Are we ready to scale it? And keeping your eyes and engineering the meeting to do that is like one of the most critical and unrecognized aspects of being successful at this. And in my working with a lot of big leaders through big decision points, like they have an uncanny ability to shut down the conversation when it's like focus on small ball topics and to like, okay, we are where we are. The only thing that matters is what's our next best move on this. And that's the essence of that. That's the lesson of this chapter.
Okay. So obviously there's a lot in this book, but one of the things I was curious about as I was finishing the book is now that you've talked to people who've read it, right? Are there responses that have surprised you? Are there unintended consequences or pieces there? I'd be curious.
Well, one is I've had people come to me like, oh, I'm applying this kind of for how I'm thinking about my career and everything, right? And I certainly didn't mean it, but it's like as a career book, it's like, oh, that's really an interesting application of kind of like the think big, but come back to like, well, what's my next best available test? What relative to it and everything. But the other thing is how difficult it is to change working habits within teams and companies. And so we battled this at T-Mobile. I've kind of fought it in so many circumstances of having the willingness to actually try a different way of working relative to this. The book, we kept the book pretty thin, but we offloaded a lot of tools and templates.
Yes. I was going to mention, you kind of hide that link. And I'm like, there's so much good stuff.
Available for free, because my goal is to truly have people work and try these things out in their own way. But I think that's, it's not so much a surprise. It kind of just confirmed what I know, which is developing this habit of slowing down, focusing on the problem, thinking through things before our enthusiasm and our sense of urgency just takes hold and we start committing to big things without really recognizing them for what they are, which is how a lot of these big bets go and why they end up being disasters, and disasters not just for the company, but disasters for careers. And we wrote for companies, but we really wrote for the teams that have to lead these big bets because, as my co-author Kevin McCaffrey said, there's nothing as cool for your career as to be involved in a big bet that makes an impact. But there's also something that's not quite as risky as doing that too for a big bet that isn't set up in the right way. And so we really wrote for those teams.
That's a really good point because you'd said earlier that you're not a big fan of doing a transformation before you need to do a transformation. And if you look at this book, it can feel like, well, yeah, if we transform to an entirely different company, John, then we could do transformations, right? But it's very actionable the way it's laid out. And that's why the tools and templates are also another piece. And you ideally would do all of these things, but you start with some of these things and you're going to start to make an impact. And I think you guys really structured it that way so that it could be sort of edible along the way and not just like, well, if you're not doing these things, best of luck to you, sir.
But we do position it like as a executive book because at the end of the day, if senior leaders don't understand these fundamental concepts, they don't have to understand all the details of the technique, but they need to understand, this is different than a well understood incremental operational project. I therefore have to set it up and run it very differently. Then no matter how well intentioned kind of the employee base is at applying these things, they're set up for real risk because senior leaders don't understand that this is fundamentally a different type of battle that we are entering into, and it requires a different strategy to it.
Yeah. Okay. I have two questions for you. One is, we talked about lots of different things today. If you had people listening do two things differently tomorrow based on what we talked about today, what would that be?
Stay in the problem space a little longer, especially the bigger the change, the more complex the situation, you need to really get at, as we call it, the what sucks of the situation. But people just tend to think that in a meeting, they can get to that and everything. And that would not be it. And I think the second one, and we touched well on this, is that communication, the right type of communication is the accelerant, is the catalyst to really driving change across an ecosystem, across an organization. And if you can do a better job at having a communication plan that actually helps people understand the problem and our hypothesis about the future state, then you're going to be a different type of transformational leader.
Nice. Okay. And my last question was, where can people find out more about you, about the book, about those templates that you talk about?
Yeah, absolutely.
Where would you like people to go?
So you can go to bigbetleadership.com to get all the templates. The book's available in a beautiful, print hardback, Kindle, and a very good audio book. We wrote it specifically to be a very good listen. That's why we didn't burden it with a lot of figures and graphs and things like that. And I'm easy to reach. John Rossman at LinkedIn or johnrossman.com. So
awesome. It was such a pleasure having you on today, John. Thank you so much for coming.
Rebecca, thanks for the preparation. Thanks for the great conversation. Thank you.
Awesome. All right. That does it for today's episode. Thanks everyone for listening. And don't forget to join us next week when we tackle another great topic designed to help you elevate your product, your company, and your career.